England and Scotland sign the Acts of Union to become the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Spain grants monopoly of American slave trade to Britain via the Asinto de Negros. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, having returned to the Ohio Valley with a regiment of Virginia provincial troops, defeats a French force near the Great Meadows. After the battle, Washington's Native American allies, led by Seneca Chieftain Harrison, attack the French captives, killing the French commander and scalping the wounded. A company of colonial militia from Virginia under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, and a small number of Mingo warriors led by Tanaka Harrison, ambushes a force of 35 Canadians under the command of Joseph Colon de Villiers de Jumonville. After a skirmish with the French soldiers, killing 10 men, including the French commander, Lieutenant Colonel George Washington then retreats to an ill-placed and makeshift palisade he calls Fort Necessity. He is forced to surrender when the French surrounded the fort. The campaign ends in humiliation for Washington and ignites the French and Indian War. The Albany Congress secures the support and cooperation of the Iroquois in fighting the French, and forms a colonial alliance based on a design by Benjamin Franklin. The plan passes unanimously, but when the delegates return to their colonies with the plan, not a single provincial legislature will ratify it. Although he resigned his commission after the surrender, George Washington returns to the frontier as a volunteer aide to General Edward Braddock. Braddock has been sent by the King of England to drive the French from the Ohio country. Braddock's army is routed near the Monongahela River and flees in confusion to Virginia. During the battle, while attempting to rally the British soldiers, Washington has 2 horses shot out from under him and 4 bullet holes shot through his coat. Although he behaves with conspicuous bravery, Washington can do little except lead the broken survivors to safety. This earned him the sobriquet Hero of the Monongahela. As Spain enters the war as a French ally, it suffers defeats from British naval forces. The Treaty of Paris was signed by the kingdoms of Great Britain, France and Spain, with Portugal in agreement, after Great Britain and Prussia's victory over France and Spain during the 7 Years' War. France gives up claims to all of its North American possessions. All land west of the Mississippi and New Orleans goes to Spain. All land east of the Mississippi River and Canada goes to England. The Proclamation of 1763 provides that all lands west of the heads of all rivers which flowed into the Atlantic Ocean from the west or northwest are off limits to the colonists. This excludes the rich Ohio Valley and all territory from the Ohio to the Mississippi rivers from settlement. The Sugar Act reduces the rate of tax on molasses from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon. Due to corruption, the tax is mostly evaded and undercuts the intention of the initial tax. The Sugar Act takes measures that the duty be strictly enforced. The Currency Act assumes control of the colonial currency system. The colonies suffer a trade deficit with Great Britain to begin with and argue that the shortage of hard capital will further exacerbate the situation. The Quartering Act of 1765 requires the colonies to house British soldiers in barracks provided by the colonies. If the barracks are too small to house all the soldiers, then localities are to accommodate the soldiers in local inns, livery stables, alehouses, victualling houses and the houses of sellers of wine. Patrick Henry delivers "If this be treason, make the most of it" speech. A series of resolutions are passed by the Virginia House of Burgesses in response to the Stamp Act of 1765 claiming that in accordance with long-established British law, Virginia is subject to taxation only by a parliamentary assembly to which Virginians themselves elect representatives. Since no colonial representatives were elected to Parliament, the only assembly legally allowed to raise taxes would be the Virginia General Assembly. The Stamp Act of Congress's first gathering of elected representatives from several of the American colonies to devise a unified protest against new British taxation. Great Britain was faced with a massive national debt following the 7 Years' War. The Stamp Act requires the colonists to pay a tax, represented by a stamp, on various forms of papers, documents, and playing cards. The Declaratory Act states that Parliament's authority is the same in America as in Britain and asserts Parliament's authority to pass laws that are binding on the American colonies. The Townshind Revenue Act places taxes on glass, lead, painters' colors, and paper. It gives customs officials broad authority to enforce the taxes and punish smugglers through the use of writs of assistance, general warrants that can be used to search private property for smuggled goods. Boston Non-Importation Agreement by the colonists restricts the importation of goods to the city of Boston. This agreement is signed by more than 60 merchants and traders. After 2 weeks' time, there are only 16 traders who do not join the effort. British soldiers are harassed by a mob in Boston, leading them to shoot and kill several people. Approximately 86% of all the tea in America at the time is smuggled Dutch tea. The Tea Act is supposed to convince the colonists to purchase tea held by the financially troubled British East India Company, on which the Townshend duties are paid, thus implicitly agreeing to accept Parliament's right of taxation. American colonists, frustrated and angry at Britain for imposing taxation without representation, dumped 342 chests of tea, imported by the British East India Company, into the harbour. The Boston Port Act punishes the inhabitants of Boston for the Boston Tea Party. The Administration of Justice Act ensures a fair trial for British officials who are charged with capital offences while upholding the law or quelling protests in Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Government Act repeals the Massachusetts Charter, and gives its royally appointed governor wide-ranging powers. The Quartering Act of 1774 allows royal governors, rather than colonial legislatures, to find homes and buildings to quarter or house British soldiers. The Quebec Act institutes a permanent administration in Canada, replacing the temporary government. General Thomas Gage, Royal Governor of the Province of Massachusetts Bay, orders the removal of gunpowder from a magazine by British soldiers. In response to this action, amid rumors that blood had been shed, alarm spreads through the countryside to Connecticut and beyond, and American patriots spring into action, fearing that war was at hand. Thousands of militiamen begin streaming toward Boston and Cambridge, and mob action forces loyalists and some government officials to flee to the protection of the British Army. Although it proves to be a false alarm, the powder alarm causes political and military leaders to proceed more carefully in the days ahead. The Articles of Association creates a universal prohibition of trade with Great Britain. Patrick Henry delivers "Give me liberty, or give me death," from a speech made to the Second Virginia Convention. Joseph Warren assigned William Dawes, along with Revere, the mission of riding north to Lexington to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock of their impending arrest, and to alert the colonial Minutemen that the British were on the move. Dawes would arrive in Lexington approximately half an hour after Revere, because the latter's horse had supposedly been faster. Paul Revere arranged for Samuel Prescott to meet himself and Dawes on the road from Lexington to Concord. A native of Concord, Prescott is familiar with the territory and is able to serve as a guide for the two men on their nighttime journey. When the three are met along the road to Concord by British officers and forced to split up, Prescott will be the only one of the three to eventually reach Concord, carrying Warren's news to that part of the state. General Gage sends 700 men to seize munitions stored by the colonial militia at Concord. Several riders, including Paul Revere, alert the countryside. Israel-Bissell rode 4 days and 6 hours along the Old Post Road, covering a total of 345 miles in that time. Bissell began his journey in Watertown, Massachusetts, just to the west of Boston, and drove his first horse so hard that it died just outside of Worcester, Massachusetts. He continued down to Philadelphia, warning the militias along the way. Paul Revere is captured by a British patrol. British troops enter Lexington, finding 77 Minutemen formed up on the village common. Shots are exchanged, 8 Minutemen are killed, the outnumbered colonial militia disperse, and the British moved on to Concord. At Concord, the troops search for military supplies, but find relatively little, as the colonists have taken steps to hide many of the supplies. During the search, there is a confrontation at the North Bridge. A small company of British troops fire on a much larger column of colonial militia, which return fire, and eventually rout the British, who return to the village center and rejoin the other troops there. By the time the Redcoats begin the return march to Boston, several thousand militiamen have gathered along the road. A running fight ensues, and the British detachment suffer heavily before reaching Charlestown. New York Assembly hears Ethan Allen and Seth Warner and authorizes a Green Mountain Regiment at New York expense. Alexander Hamilton intervenes in an altercation between Commodore James Nicholson and Josiah Ogden Hoffman. Nicholson accuses Hamilton of being an abettor of Tories who had declined an interview on an earlier occasion. Hamilton challenges him to a duel. The dispute, however, is settled without an encounter. Marquis de Lafayette meets the Duke of Gloucester, the brother of King George III. Lafayette here learns about the conflict between Britain and the colonists. Blaming the British for killing his father, Lafayette decides to join the Americans to strike back at England. Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense, advocating independence from Great Britain to people in the 13 colonies. British forces evacuate Boston. John Adams convenes the Committee of Five to draft a Declaration of Independence. The 5 members of the committee are John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston and Roger Sherman. The committee chooses Jefferson to write the first draft. The Continental Congress votes to declare independence from Great Britain, formally adopting the Lee Resolution. The Lee Resolution states that the 13 colonies in America are free and independent states, separate from the British Empire and creating what becomes the United States of America. The Continental Congress begins debating and editing the draft declaration, eventually making 86 edits and cutting the length by about a fourth. Representatives from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina and Georgia sign the United States Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress approves the final draft of the declaration, formalizing what had already been decided on July 2. Congress hires printer John Dunlap to print copies of the declaration to be distributed throughout the colonies. Dunlap delivers his 200 copies of the declaration. One copy is officially entered into the Congressional Journal and the other copies are distributed throughout the colonies. The Pennsylvania Evening Post becomes the first newspaper to reprint the whole declaration, but news of the July 2 decision to declare independence has already been widely reported and various celebrations and discussions are already taking place throughout the colonies. The declaration is read publicly to the people of Philadelphia. Around this time, Congress sends a copy of the declaration to its emissary in Europe to be distributed to the various European governments. However, the original letter is lost and the declaration isn't formally delivered to Great Britain and the rest of Europe until November, when news of the declaration had already reached Europe. New York finally approves the declaration. It is the last of the 13 colonies to do so. The Continental Congress decides to have an engrossed copy of the declaration made, meaning a clean, readable, handwritten copy on parchment. Timothy Matlack, who was the assistant to the Secretary of Congress, probably makes the copy. This is the copy now housed at the National Archives. Those delegates who had voted in favor of independence and who are in attendance that day sign the engrossed copy of the Declaration. 50 delegates sign on this day. 6 more will sign later. Washington is defeated in the Battle of Long Island. Washington's army escapes. Marquis de Lafayette meets Silas Deane. Deane was chosen by the Continental Congress to recruit foreign soldiers. Lafayette signs a contract with Silas Deane to become Major General in the Patriot Army. Because Congress can't pay for his travel, Marquis de Lafayette buys his own ship to travel to America. At the Battle of Princeton, Continental Army General Mercer's horse is shot from under him. Getting to his feet, he is quickly surrounded by British troops who mistake him for George Washington and order him to surrender. Outnumbered, he draws his saber and begins an unequal contest. He is finally beaten to the ground, then bayoneted repeatedly, 7 times, and left for dead. When he learns of the British attack and finds some of Mercer's men in retreat, Washington himself enters the fray. Washington rallies Mercer's men and pushes back the British regiments, but Mercer had been left on the field to die with multiple bayonet wounds to his body and blows to his head. Legend has it that a beaten Mercer, with a bayonet still impaled in him, did not want to leave his men and the battle, was given a place to rest on a white oak tree's trunk, while those who remained with him stood their ground. Continental Army General Hugh Mercer dies of his wounds from the Battle of Princeton. Marquis de Lafayette fails to receive permission to leave France. Being chased by the police, Lafayette and 12 men he recruited cross the border into Spain. Here, they board his ship and set out for America. Continental Congress resolves the flag of the United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, that the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field, representing a new constellation. Lafayette arrives in Philadelphia. At the Battle of Oriskany, Continental Army General Nicholas Herkimer's horse is shot, and he is seriously wounded in the leg. In spite of his injuries, he sits propped up against a tree, lights his pipe, and directs his men in the battle, rallying them to avoid 2 panicked retreats. When they withdraw, they carry him home. Continental Army General Nicholas Herkimer dies after bleeding profusely during an operation to amputate his leg after the wound he received during the Battle of Oriskany had become infected. British General Howe lands at Head of Elk, Maryland. Marquis de Lafayette is wounded during the Battle of the Brandywine, shot in the leg while fighting. After being carried to Moravian Hospital, Lafayette quickly recovers. The Continental Congress flees Philadelphia as the British move in. British under Howe occupy Philadelphia. British capture Philadelphia. Washington's army retires to winter quarters at Valley Forge. The United States and France sign the French alliance. British General William Howe is replaced by Henry Clinton. Ethan Allen arranged to be freed in a prisoner exchange for Colonel Archibald Campbell. Ethan Allen returns from captivity. Washington's army leaves Valley Forge. Alexander Hamilton serves as a second to Lieutenant Colonel John Laurens in Lawrence's duel with Major General Charles Lee. Laurens charges that Lee had cast aspersions on the character of George Washington. After Laurens wounds Lee, Hamilton and Major Evan Edwards, a member of the 11th Pennsylvania Regiment who was Lee's second, stop the duel. The British capture Savannah. Marquis de Lafayette returns to France to visit his wife. Before preparing to leave, Lafayette convinces the French government to send more supplies to aid Washington. Alexander Hamilton challenges Dr. William Gordon, a Congregational clergyman in Jamaica Plains, Massachusetts, on the ground that Gordon made insulting remarks about Hamilton's political views to Francis Darner, a Massachusetts congressman. The duel is never fought because Gordon refuses to accept the challenge. Washington's army winters at Morristown, NJ. Marquis de Lafayette sails to France to see his wife give birth to their son. He names him George Washington Lafayette. When he returns to the colonies, he brings 6,000 elite French troops, weapons, food, ammunition, and ships. Washington credits him for tipping the war finally in the colonists' pleas. British capture Charleston, SC. John Andre arrested, leading to the exposure of Benedict Arnold's plans to cede West Point to the British. The Second Continental Congress meets with delegates from the 13 colonies in America which unite in the American Revolutionary War. Articles of Confederation acts as an agreement among the 13 original states of the United States of America that serves as its first constitution. Americans recapture Augusta, GA. Cornwallis surrounded on land and sea by American and French. Surrenders at Yorktown, VA. British evacuate Savannah, GA. British and Americans sign preliminary articles of peace. British leave Charleston, SC. Congress ratifies preliminary peace treaty. British troops leave New York City. George Washington resigns as Commander-in-Chief. The U.S. Constitution is signed. Delaware is admitted to the Union. Pennsylvania is admitted to the Union. New Jersey is admitted to the Union. Georgia is admitted to the Union. Connecticut is admitted to the Union. Massachusetts is admitted to the Union. Maryland is admitted to the Union. South Carolina is admitted to the Union. The Constitution of the United States is ratified. New Hampshire is admitted to the Union. Virginia is admitted to the Union. New York is admitted to the Union. In New York, Alexander Hamilton eulogizes Nathanael Greene, who had died 3 years earlier. The speech describes Greene's military prowess in glowing tones befitting Greene's achievement. However, during his speech Hamilton makes one very provocative remark. He praises Greene's success on the plains of Springfield despite the fact that at that point, Greene had been a general without an army, aided or rather embarrassed by small fugitive bodies of volunteer militia, the mimicry of soldiership. Agnes Burke, an anti-federalist to the First Congress of the United States, interprets Hamilton's words as a denigration of all militia. Burke interpreted Hamilton's words as a denigration of all militia. In France, Lafayette presented a draft of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen to the Assembly, written by himself in consultation with Jefferson. After the dismissal of Finance Minister Jacques Necker, who was seen as a reformer, lawyer Camille Desmoulins assembled between 700 and 1,000 armed insurgents. The king had the royal army under the Duc de Broglie surround Paris. The fortress known as the Bastille was stormed by insurgents. The National Assembly approved Lafayette's declaration. King Louis XVI rejects Lafayette's declaration. A Parisian crowd led by women fishmongers marched to Versailles in response to the scarcity of bread. Members of the National Guard followed the march, with Lafayette reluctantly leading them. At Versailles, the king accepted the Assembly's votes on the declaration, but refused requests to go to Paris. At dawn, the crowd breaks into the palace. Lafayette takes the royal family onto the palace balcony and attempts to restore order, but the crowd insists that the king and his family move to Paris and the Tuileries Palace. The king comes onto the balcony and the crowd starts chanting "Vive le Roi." Marie Antoinette then appears with her children, but she is told to send the children back in. She returns alone and people shout to shoot her, but she stands her ground and no one opens fire. Lafayette kisses her hand, leading to cheers from the crowd. North Carolina is admitted to the Union. Agnes Burke uses the floor of the House of Representatives to attack Alexander Hamilton vehemently for the mimicry comment. Angrily, Burke pointed out that in the Revolution, state militia turned the wind and tide of fortune against the British troops. Their graves are to be seen scattered over our glades and woodlands. They are now no more, but in their name. I now declare that the assertion was false, and that the gentleman who expressed it. At this point, several congressmen apparently called Burke to order for his invective. Immediately following Burke's accusatory speech, Hamilton complains to Burke that "you made use of some very harsh expressions in relation to me." The New Yorker asserts that his comment had not intended to insult the state militias, but related merely to a specific battle in New Jersey, in which Greene had to make do with what Hamilton called small fugitive bodies of volunteer militia. Hamilton demands of Burke to decide what conduct in consequence of the explanation will be proper on your part, opening the possibility of an apology or a duel. In his reply to Alexander Hamilton, Ignace Burke denies Hamilton's defense, arguing that others who had heard the speech had drawn the same conclusion as he. Burke recounts various heroic deeds of the South Carolina militia and commented at length on the pain he felt when he heard them denounced as the mimicry of soldiery. As for his invective against Hamilton, Burke notes, "If yesterday I retorted on you rather harshly, your own recollection will whisper to you, and your own friends will tell you, if I mistake not, that you brought it on yourself." Since neither Burke nor Hamilton were strangers to the Code Duello, the affair might well have led to bloodshed had not an ad hoc committee of congressmen, including Gerry and King, intervened. They suggested that Hamilton precisely restate his disavowal, and that Burke should then retract his earlier statements. The two politicians eventually agreed to do so, and the affair was settled. Rhode Island is admitted to the Union. Vermont is admitted to the Union. Thomas Paine publishes The Rights of Man, which posits that popular political revolution is permissible when a government does not safeguard the natural rights of its people. First Amendment to the Constitution protects freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly and the right to petition the government. Second Amendment to the Constitution protects the right to keep and bear arms. Third Amendment to the Constitution restricts the quartering of soldiers in private homes. Fourth Amendment to the Constitution prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures and sets out requirements for search warrants based on probable cause. Fifth Amendment to the Constitution sets out rules for indictment by grand jury and eminent domain, protects the right to due process, and prohibits self-incrimination and double jeopardy. Sixth Amendment to the Constitution protects the right to a speedy public trial by jury, to notification of criminal accusations, to confront the accuser, to obtain witnesses and to retain counsel. Seventh Amendment to the Constitution provides for the right to a jury trial in civil lawsuits. Eighth Amendment to the Constitution prohibits excessive fines and excessive bail, as well as cruel and unusual punishment. Ninth Amendment to the Constitution states that rights not enumerated in the Constitution are retained by the people. 10th Amendment to the Constitution states that the federal government possesses only those powers delegated, or enumerated, to it through the Constitution. Kentucky is admitted to the Union. Alexander Hamilton accuses John F. Mercer of buying government debt at inflated prices to help speculators. The two duel 5 months later, however. Mercer is able to defuse the situation. James Reynolds is jailed for participation in a scheme involving unpaid back wages intended for Revolutionary War veterans. He uses his knowledge about Hamilton's sex affair with his wife, whom he was blackmailing Hamilton to keep secret, to bargain his way out of his own troubles. Reynolds knew Hamilton would have to choose between revealing his affair with Maria or falsely admitting complicity to the charges. James Monroe, Abraham Venable and Frederick Muhlenberg decide to personally confront Alexander Hamilton with the information they had received from Reynolds, supported by the notes of Hamilton's payments to Reynolds that Maria had given them to corroborate her husband's accusations. Denying any financial impropriety, Hamilton reveals the true nature of his relationship with Maria Reynolds and her husband in all its unsavory details. Apparently convinced that Hamilton was not guilty of the charge of public misconduct, Monroe, Venable and Muhlenberg agree not to make public the information and documents on the Reynolds affair. Monroe and his colleagues assure Hamilton that the matter was settled. However, Monroe sends the letters to his close personal friend, Thomas Jefferson. What Monroe does not expect, however, is that the clerk who has worked with the investigators would make extra copies and pass them off to pamphleteer James Corlader. The 11th Amendment to the Constitution makes states immune from suits from out-of-state citizens and foreigners not living within the state borders, lays the foundation for state sovereign immunity. Alexander Hamilton attempts to defend the Jay Treaty in a meeting in New York City. During the course of the day's events, Hamilton interferes in a quarrel between James Nicholson and Josiah Ogden Hoffman, a Federalist lawyer. Nicholson calls Hamilton an abettor of Tories and states that Hamilton would not pursue the affair for he had declined an interview upon a former occasion. Hamilton, offended by Nicholson's remarks, challenges him to a duel. The seconds selected by Alexander Hamilton and, during a public gathering at New York City Hall, news of a recently completed Treaty of Amity and Commerce with Great Britain, negotiated by John Jay and granting significant latitude to Britain, had arrived in the States. Tensions are high, and the meeting turns increasingly raucous. It is suggested that, as the tensions are growing more personal, that they be settled elsewhere. Alexander Hamilton then steps forward declaring that if the parties are to contend in a personal way, he is ready, that he would fight the whole detestable faction one by one. Mathurin Livingston, a member of the prominent Livingston family, and an American lawyer and politician from New York, steps up to him and tells him very coolly that he is one of the party, that he accepts the challenge and will meet him in half an hour where he pleased. Hamilton said he has an affair on his hands already with one of the party, meaning a quarrel with Commodore Nicholson, and when that is settled he would call on him. The seconds selected by Alexander Hamilton and James Nicholson meet for the impending duel presumably and, in an effort to avoid the duel, ask Hamilton to submit the kind of apology which he would accept from Nicholson. The apology states, Mr. Nicholson declares that the warmth of the expressions which he recollects to have used to Mr. Hamilton proceeded from a misapprehension of the nature of his interposition in the altercation between Mr. Hoffman and Mr. Nicholson, that as to the suggestion alleged to have been made by Mr. Nicholson, namely that Mr. Hamilton had declined a former interview, he does not recollect and is not conscious of having made it, neither did he intend the imputation which it would seem to imply, and that if he did make the suggestion he regrets the pain which it must have occasioned to Mr. Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton writes to Mathurin Livingston, "It is not my wish to cavil, nor can I as a reasonable man have any desire to pursue the question between us further than a due regard to my own delicacy may demand. But having weighed maturely the contents of your letter of yesterday, I am obliged to think that it is not sufficiently explicit. The course of your own ideas and conduct hitherto must afford you a consciousness whether on the occasion alluded to there could have been an intention on your part to throw at me the imputation mentioned in my first letter, and if there was any situation which may prevent a recollection of what passed, it is still in your power at this time to satisfy what is due to delicacy by a disavowal of the exceptionable sentiment. Tennessee is admitted to the Union. Alexander Hamilton writes to Monroe, Muhlenberg, and Venable asking them to dispute the charges in Calder's pamphlets. He doesn't blame them directly, but suspected a dishonorable infidelity somewhere. Alexander Hamilton has not received a reply from Monroe, but learns that he is in New York visiting family. He writes a terse letter requesting an interview that insinuates a challenge to a duel. Hamilton would bring a friend, a second, in the ritual of dueling, and Monroe should, too. Alexander Hamilton and his brother-in-law John Church visit Monroe, who is accompanied by his friend David Galveston. Hamilton again demands an explanation for Calder's pamphlets. When Monroe says he had sealed and sent all of the papers relating to the investigation to a friend, Hamilton counters that that was totally false. Monroe fumes and both men jump to their feet. "Do you say I represented falsely? You are a scoundrel," Monroe charges. "I will meet you like a gentleman," Hamilton replies, a veiled request for a duel. "I am ready, get your pistols," Monroe retorts. The two men must have come close to blows, because Church and Galveston have to rise and separate the angry men. Ultimately, a third party helped to defuse the situation. James Monroe has also invites a mutual acquaintance, Aaron Burr, to be the intermediary as the men argue back and forth. Burr diffuses the situation, and after everyone cools down, Monroe promises that he and his co-investigators will write Hamilton with a full explanation of what they knew of the affair. James Thompson Calder, a political pamphleteer and journalist, publishes a pamphlet titled The History of the United States for 1796, including a variety of interesting particulars relative to the federal government previous to that period. This pamphlet documents the affair of Alexander Hamilton and Maria Reynolds. Included were copies of the documents Hamilton had furnished to the Monroe Commission in December 1792. Hamilton responds to Calder's revelations by printing his own 95-page pamphlet called Observations on Certain Documents, later known as the Reynolds pamphlet, in which he denies all charges of corruption. He does not, however, deny his relationship with Maria Reynolds. Instead, he openly admits it and apologizes for it. While his candor is admired, the affair severely damages his reputation. While Hamilton's admitted affair serves to confirm rival Thomas Jefferson's conviction that he is untrustworthy, it does nothing to change Washington's opinion of him, who still holds him in very high esteem and who still views Hamilton as the dominant force in establishing federal law and government. John B. Church, brother-in-law of Alexander Hamilton, accuses Aaron Burr, who defeated not only Hamilton and Church's father-in-law for the 1,791 Senate seat, of taking a bribe from the Holland Company. Burr and Church rode to New Jersey. Perhaps Burr used his own, but Church as the challenged one certainly used his own high-tech, for then, weapon. He was way too rich to use Burr's pistol. Burr's second has trouble ramming the bullet home. Reasonable since Church's pistols were .54 caliber oversized for dueling, and a patch with grease was necessary for a conventional lead bullet ball. Davis tells us the second hit the ramrod with a rock, and it still wasn't home, so he gave the pistol to Burr and said, "Try it because Church is ready, we'll reload on the second shot." They fired. Church hit Burr's coat, and Burr missed Church. They began to reload when Church realized his secret advantage was not fail-safe, so he apologized to Burr and declared he had been indiscreet and was sorry for it. It is later discovered 1975 that Church's pistol had a secret hair trigger. By pushing the trigger forward hard, only a half-pound of pressure, and not 10 pounds of pressure were needed to fire the half-diameter lead ball bullet. These were improper weapons for a fair duel. Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, publishes the pamphlet concerning the public conduct and character of John Adams, stating re-electing Adams, also a Federalist, would be a catastrophic choice. This all but ensures a victory for Thomas Jefferson of the opposing Democratic-Republican Party. In the 1800 United States presidential election, between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, under the rules of the electoral system that were in place prior to the 1804 ratification of the 12th Amendment, each member of the Electoral College cast 2 votes, with no distinction made between electoral votes for president and electoral votes for vice president. Both parties formally nominated tickets. The Democratic Republicans nominate a ticket consisting of Jefferson and Aaron Burr, while the Federalists nominate a ticket consisting of Adams and Charles C. Pinckney. Each party forms a plan in which one of their respective electors will vote for a third candidate or abstain so that their preferred presidential candidate, Adams for the Federalists and Jefferson for the Democratic Republicans, will win one more vote than the party's other nominee. At the end of the long and bitter campaign, Jefferson and Burr each win 73 electoral votes, Adams wins 65 electoral votes, and Pinckney wins 64 electoral votes. The Democratic Republicans' failure to execute their plan to award Jefferson one more vote than Burr results in a tie, which necessitates a contingent election in the House of Representatives. Under the terms laid out in the Constitution, the outgoing House of Representatives chooses between Jefferson and Burr. Burr is accused of campaigning for the presidency himself in the contingent election despite being a member of Jefferson's party. Each state delegation casts one vote, and a victory in the contingent election requires one candidate to win a majority of the state delegations. Neither Burr nor Jefferson is able to win on the first 35 ballots of the contingent election, as most Federalist congressmen back Burr and all Democratic-Republican congressmen back Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton favors Jefferson over Burr, and he convinces several Federalists to switch their support to Jefferson, giving Jefferson a victory on the 36th ballot of the contingent election. New York lawyer, George Eaker gives an Independence Day speech hosted by a New York State Militia Brigade and by the Tammany Society. The Tammany Society, better known as Tammany Hall, is a Democratic Republican Party political organization that Aaron Burr had built into a political machine. In the speech, Ika reportedly says that Alexander Hamilton would not be opposed to overthrowing Thomas Jefferson's presidency by force. Philip Hamilton, son of Alexander Hamilton, and a friend named Stephen Price encounter George Ika while attending a play at the Park Theatre. Philip confronts Ika about the speech, and in the ensuing disturbance, Ika is heard to call Philip and Price damned rascals. In response to the verbal hostilities and Ika's insult, the two formally challenge Ika to a duel. Alexander Hamilton counsels his son, telling him to engage in a elope, throwing away his first shot. Stephen Price and George Ika duels in Weehawken, New Jersey. The duel ends with neither party injured, but 4 shots are fired. Philip Hamilton and George Ika duel. Borrowing dueling pistols used by John B. Church. Philip takes his father's advice, and refuses to raise his pistol to fire after he and Ika had counted 10 paces and faced each other. Ika, following suit, does not shoot either. For the first minute, both men stand, doing nothing, both refusing to shoot. After a minute, Ika finally raises his pistol, and Philip does the same. Ika shoots, striking Philip above his right hip. The bullet passes through his body and lodges in his left arm. In what may have been an involuntary spasm, Philip also fires his pistol before hitting the ground, but this bullet does nothing. As Philip falls on the ground bleeding, he displays, as described by both sides, exemplary poise and dignity. His manner on the ground was calm and composed beyond expression, the New York Post reported. The idea of his own danger seemed to be lost in anticipation of the satisfaction which he might receive from the final triumph of his generous moderation. Philip is then rushed across the river to the home of his aunt, Angelica Schuyler Church, in Manhattan. She wrote, "His conduct was extraordinary during this trial." Philip dies at 5 a.m., 14 hours after the initial wound. The U.S. Supreme Court issues a decision in Marbury v. Madison that establishes the principle of judicial review in the United States, meaning that American courts have the power to strike down laws, statutes, and some government actions that they find to violate the Constitution of the United States. It establishes that the U.S. Constitution is actual law, not just a statement of political principles and ideals, and helps define the boundary between the constitutionally separate executive and judicial branches of the federal government. Ohio is admitted to the Union. The United States acquires the territory of Louisiana from the French for $15 million. Alexander Hamilton travels to the Albany home of Judge Ebenezer Purdy to confront him with reports that he had revived an old canard, that before the Constitutional Convention Hamilton had secretly plotted with Britain to install a son of George III as an American king in exchange for Canada and other territories. To emphasize the gravity of the visit, Hamilton took along another judge, Nathaniel Pendleton. Purdy refuses to disclose the source for his story, admitting only that the man lived in Westchester and had seen the telltale British letter in Hamilton's office. The source, in fact, was Pierre Van Cortlandt, Jr., who had clerked for Hamilton in the mid-1780s before becoming a Republican politician. More to the point, Van Cortlandt was now the son-in-law of George Clinton. Purdy mentions that Governor Clinton has a copy of the British letter, and Hamilton decides to contact him. That same day, Clinton is nominated by the Republicans as Jefferson's running mate for vice president. Hamilton demands of his longtime foe a frank and candid explanation of so much of the matter as relates to yourself. Clinton says that a General Macomb had shown him a copy of the letter around the time of the Constitutional Convention. Hamilton insists that Clinton send him the letter, if he retained it in his files, so that he can hunt down its source. Clinton sends a blunt, unrepentant reply, saying that he cannot find the letter but precisely recollected its contents. It recommended a government for the United States similar to that of Great Britain. The American House of Lords was to be composed partly of the British hereditary nobility and partly of such of our own citizens as should have most merit in bringing about the measure. Clinton clearly gives credence to this nonsensical fairy tale, and he no longer feels any need to defer to Hamilton, who had lost his power and could now be bullied. In a guarded response, Hamilton expresses hope that if Clinton finds the letter, he would hand it over to him. The Albany Register publishes a letter opposing Aaron Burr's candidacy. The letter was originally sent from Charles Cooper to Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, former Senator Philip Schuyler. It makes reference to a previous statement by Cooper. General Hamilton and Judge Kent have declared in substance that they looked upon Mr. Burr to be a dangerous man, and one who ought not be trusted with the reins of government. Cooper goes on to emphasize that he can describe in detail a still more despicable opinion which General Hamilton has expressed of Mr. Burr at a political dinner. Burr responds in a letter which points particularly to the phrase more despicable and demands a prompt and unqualified acknowledgement or denial of the use of any expression which would warrant the assertion of Dr. Cooper. 12th Amendment to the Constitution revises presidential election procedures by having the president and vice president elected together as opposed to the vice president being the runner-up in the presidential election. Alexander Hamilton replies to Aaron Burr's letter, indicating that he cannot be held responsible for Cooper's interpretation of his words, yet he does not fault the interpretation, concluding that he will abide the consequences should Burr remain unsatisfied. A recurring theme in their correspondence is that Burr seeks avowal or disavowal of anything that could justify Cooper's characterization, while Hamilton protests that there are no specifics. Aaron Burr replies to Alexander Hamilton's letter, stating that political opposition can never absolve gentlemen from the necessity of a rigid adherence to the laws of honor and the rules of decorum. Alexander Hamilton replies to Aaron Burr's letter, that he has no other answer to give than that which has already been given. Aaron Burr challenges Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton accepts. Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr duel at the dueling grounds of Weehawken, New Jersey. The same location Hamilton's son was killed 3 years earlier, and also the same location John Church and Aaron Burr dueled 5 years earlier. Hamilton used pistols supplied by Church. Hamilton had previously written letters that were to be opened if he died, or destroyed by him if he lived. These letters said he did not intend to fire at Burr, thus making him a martyr. Colonel Burr arrived first on the ground, as had been previously agreed. When General Hamilton arrived, the parties exchanged salutations, and the seconds proceeded to make their arrangements. They measured the distance, 10 full paces, and cast lots for the choice of position. Hamilton did fire his weapon intentionally, and he fired first. But he aimed to miss Burr, sending his ball into the tree above and behind Burr's location. In so doing, he did not withhold his shot, but he did waste it, thereby honoring his pre-duel pledge. Meanwhile, Burr, who did not know about the pledge, did know that a projectile from Hamilton's gun had whizzed past him and crashed into the tree to his rear. According to the principles of the Code Giullo, Burr was perfectly justified in taking deadly aim at Hamilton and firing to kill. The fire of Colonel Burr took effect, and General Hamilton almost instantly fell. Colonel Burr advanced toward General Hamilton with a manner and gesture that appeared to General Hamilton's friend to be expressive of regret, but, without speaking, turned about and withdrew, being urged from the field by his friend, as has been subsequently stated, with a view to prevent his being recognized by the surgeon and bargeman who were then approaching. No further communication took place between the principals, and the barge that carried Colonel Burr immediately returned to the city. We conceive it proper to add, that the conduct of the parties in this interview was perfectly proper, as suited the occasion. Alexander Hamilton dies in a duel with Aaron Burr. Meriwether Lewis commits suicide at Grinder's Stand, an inn south of Nashville, Tennessee. Louisiana is admitted to the Union. The Senate approves a resolution declaring war with Great Britain by a vote of 19 to 13. The House approves the measure the same day. President James Madison signs the war declaration, marking the first time the United States of America declares war on another nation. Winfield Scott captured by British troops. After defeating the Americans at the Battle of Bladensburg, British sets fire to multiple government and military buildings, including the White House, the Capitol building, as well as other facilities of the U.S. government. British forces destroy Library of Congress, containing 3,000 books. The Treaty of Ghent ends the war between the United States and Great Britain. The treaty restores relations between the two parties to status quo ante bellum by restoring the pre-war borders of June 1812. Andrew Jackson leads American forces to victory at the Battle of New Orleans. War of 1812. Spain loses West Florida to the United States. Indiana is admitted to the Union. Mississippi is admitted to the Union. Illinois is admitted to the Union. The U.S. Supreme Court issues a decision in McCulloch v. Maryland that defines the scope of the U.S. Congress's legislative power and how it relates to the powers of American state legislatures. It establishes firstly that the necessary and proper clause of the U.S. Constitution gives the U.S. federal government certain implied powers that are not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution, and secondly that the American federal government is supreme over the states, and so states' ability to interfere with the federal government is limited. Alabama is admitted to the Union. The United States federal legislation, the Missouri Compromise, admits Missouri as a slave state, in exchange for legislation which prohibits slavery north of the 36° 30' parallel except for Missouri. Maine is admitted to the Union. Missouri is admitted to the Union. The Monroe Doctrine is issued arguing that any intervention in the politics of the Americas by foreign powers is a potentially hostile act against the United States. Nearly all Latin American colonies of Spain and Portugal had achieved, or were at the point of gaining, independence from the Portuguese and Spanish empires. It states that further efforts by various European states to take control of any independent state in the Americas will be viewed as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. It also notes that U.S. will recognize and not interfere with existing European colonies or meddle in the internal affairs of European countries. The U.S. Supreme Court issues a decision in Gibbons v. Ogden that the power to regulate interstate commerce, granted to Congress by the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, encompasses the power to regulate navigation. After an invitation from President James Monroe and Congress, Lafayette arrives in New York. He is greeted by a group of Revolutionary War veterans who had fought alongside him many years before. New York erupts for 4 continuous days and nights of celebration. He then departs for what he thinks will be a restful trip to Boston, but instead finds the route lined by cheering citizens, with welcomes organized in every town along the way. According to Unger, it was a mystical experience they would relate to their heirs through generations to come. Lafayette had materialized from a distant age, the last leader and hero at the nation's defining moment. They knew they and the world would never see his kind again. Lafayette intends to visit only the original 13 states during a 4-month visit, but the stay stretches to 16 months as he visits all 24 states. The results of the 1824 United States presidential election is inconclusive, as no candidate wins a majority of the electoral vote. The election for Vice President, John C. Calhoun, is elected with a comfortable majority. Because none of the candidates for president garnered an electoral vote majority, the U.S. House of Representatives, under the provisions of the 12th Amendment, holds a contingent election, electing John Quincy Adams as president. King Charles of France signs the Ordinances of St. Cloud, removing the franchise from the middle class and dissolving the Chamber of Deputies. Parisians erect barricades throughout the city, and riots erupt. In defiance, the chamber continues to meet. When Lafayette, who was at La Grange, hears what is going on, he races into the city, and is acclaimed as a leader of the revolution. When his fellow deputies become indecisive, Lafayette goes to the barricades, and soon the royalist troops are routed. Fearful that the excesses of the 1789 revolution are about to be repeated, deputies make Lafayette head of a restored National Guard, and charge him with keeping order. The chamber is willing to proclaim him as ruler, but he refuses a grant of power he deems unconstitutional. King Charles of France abdicates the throne. Many young revolutionaries seek a republic, but Lafayette feels this will lead to civil war, and chooses to offer the throne to the Duc d'Orleans, Louis-Philippe, who has lived in America and has far more of a common touch than did Charles. Lafayette secures the agreement of Louis-Philippe, who accepts the throne, to various reforms. The general remains as commander of the National Guard. Nat Turner is tried for conspiring to rebel and making insurrection. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Nat Turner is hanged in Jerusalem, Virginia, and his corpse is drawn and quartered. Winfield Scott was placed in command of the Army of Florida and ordered to plan a campaign against the Seminole tribe that eventually escalated into the Second Seminole War. The Republic of Texas declares independence from the Republic of Mexico. Mexican troops under President General Antonio López de Santa Anna reclaimed the Alamo Mission, killing the Texian and immigrant occupiers, including James Bowie and Davy Crockett. Santa Anna's cruelty during the battle inspired many Texians, both legal Texas settlers and illegal immigrants from the United States, to join the Texian army. Arkansas is admitted to the Union. Michigan is admitted to the Union. Winfield Scott oversees the forced removal of the Cherokee Nation to present-day Oklahoma. Over 4,000 Cherokees died from disease, starvation, and exposure to cold weather during the trip that became known as the Trail of Tears. Frederick Douglass escapes from bondage. Frederick Douglass gives his first anti-slavery speech. Florida is admitted to the Union. Texas is annexed by the United States. Texas formally joins the Union. Congress approves a resolution declaring war with Mexico. The Senate approves the resolution by a vote of 40 to 2. The California Republic declares independence from Mexico. Joseph Smith is murdered and the Mormons begin an exodus to Utah Territory. Iowa is admitted to the Union. Winfield Scott lands a force of 12,000 soldiers near the Mexican port city of Veracruz during the Mexican-American War. Frederick Douglass published the first edition of the North Star, a weekly anti-slavery publication that remained in circulation until June 1851 when it merged with Gerrit Smith's Liberty Party paper, based in Syracuse, New York, to form Frederick Douglass paper. Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. Mexico recognizes U.S. sovereignty over Texas and gives the U.S. ownership of California and a large area comprising roughly half of New Mexico, most of Arizona, Nevada, Utah and Colorado. Wisconsin is admitted to the Union. Senator Henry Clay introduces a series of resolutions in an attempt to seek a compromise and avert a crisis between North and South. Under the compromise, Texas surrenders its claims to present-day New Mexico and other states in return for federal assumption of Texas's public debt. California is admitted as a free state, while the remaining portions of the Mexican cession are organized into New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory. Under the concept of popular sovereignty, the people of each territory will decide whether or not slavery will be permitted. The compromise also includes a more stringent fugitive slave law and bans the slave trade in Washington, D.C. California is admitted to the Union. The Fugitive Slave Act is passed as part of the Compromise of 1850 between Southern slaveholding interests and Northern free soilers. It requires that all escaped slaves, upon capture, be returned to their masters and that officials and citizens of free states had to cooperate. During a holiday celebration sponsored by the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, Douglass delivered what many consider to be his most famous speech, entitled "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." Winfield Scott was the unsuccessful Whig candidate for the presidency of the United States, receiving on 42 electoral votes, compared to 254 votes for the winning Democratic candidate, Zachary Taylor. The United States and Mexico agreed to the Gadsden Purchase to purchase lands south of the Gila River and west of the Rio Grande. The Missouri Compromise is repealed with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It is a territorial organic act that creates the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. The United States had acquired vast amounts of sparsely settled land in the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, and since the 1840s Stephen Douglas had sought to establish a territorial government in a portion of the Louisiana Purchase that was still unorganized. To win the support of Southerners, Douglas agreed to back the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, with the status of slavery instead decided on the basis of popular sovereignty. Under popular sovereignty, the citizens of each territory, rather than Congress, would determine whether or not slavery would be allowed. After the passage of the act, pro- and anti-slavery elements flooded into Kansas with the goal of establishing a population that would vote for or against slavery, resulting in a series of armed conflicts. United States Supreme Court decides 7-2 Scott v. Sanford, often referred to as the Dred Scott decision, a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in which the court holds that the U.S. Constitution is not meant to include American citizenship for black people, regardless of whether they are enslaved or free, and so the rights and privileges that the Constitution confers upon American citizens cannot apply to them. Minnesota is admitted to the Union. Oregon is admitted to the Union. Frederick Douglass met with John Brown to discuss Brown's plan to take up arms against the U.S. government and attack the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Douglass disapproved of the scheme, and refused to get involved. After John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia Governor Richard Wise requested President James Buchanan's assistance in apprehending Douglass, who was charged with murder, robbery, and inciting servile insurrection in the state of Virginia. Secretary of War, and future Confederate General, John B. Floyd ordered Robert Anderson to relieve John Gardner as commander of the federal garrison at Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Kansas is admitted to the Union. Frederick Douglass signed on as an agent for the U.S. government to recruit black soldiers for the Volunteer Army. P.G.T. Beauregard orders the firing of shots at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, starting the Civil War. The Battle of Fort Sumter is the first engagement of the American Civil War. The Confederates hold Fort Sumter throughout most of the war. Robert Anderson evacuated Fort Sumter. First Battle of Bull Run is the first major land battle of the Civil War. The Union Army marches from Washington, D.C., to seize the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. At first, it seems as if the Union Army will prevail, but as the battle rages, the Confederates hold their ground. Once the Confederate Army receives reinforcements, their counteroffensive defeats the Union troops. The retreating Union troops leave the route to Washington, D.C., wide open. However, the Confederates are not able to pursue. After Southern forces routed the Army of Northeastern Virginia at the First Battle of Bull Run, President Lincoln urged Winfield Scott to resign as commanding general of the U.S. Army. Scott offered his resignation on the 1st of November, 1861. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, performs her first field duty at the Battle of Cedar Mountain. This is the only recorded time in the Civil War that Stonewall Jackson drew his sword during battle. Clara Barton's first experience nursing wounded soldiers at the front occurs after the Battle of Cedar Mountain. During 1862, Clara Barton delivered supplies and nursed wounded soldiers at numerous major conflicts including the Second Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Chantilly, the Battle of South Mountain, the Battle of Antietam, Maryland, and the Battle of Fredericksburg. At the Battle of Antietam, Clara Barton barely escaped death when a bullet passed through the sleeve of her dress, killing the wounded man she was attending. The Battle of Antietam is the bloodiest battle ever fought in the history of the United States with a loss of 22,717. The battle ends in the withdrawal of Lee's forces from the field, but the refusal of McClellan to pursue and destroy Lee's army when he has the chance to do so are seen as a massive failure that allows the war to continue. The immediate aftermath of the battle is enough of a victory to give President Lincoln the confidence to release the Emancipation Proclamation, which declares an end to slavery in Confederate territory. Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order of President Lincoln that emancipated, for example freed, all slaves in the states still in rebellion against the federal government. It did not apply to slaves in border states that had remained loyal to the Union, including Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. West Virginia is admitted to the Union. Abraham Lincoln delivers the Gettysburg Address. The fall of Atlanta marks the beginning of General Sherman's march to the sea. It also has a major political effect in the Union election of 1864. The capture of Atlanta gives Lincoln enough of a boost in the polls that he is able to be re-elected, something that was in doubt before the fall of the city. The Centralia Massacre. 24 unarmed Union soldiers are captured and executed in Centralia, Missouri by a band led by the pro-Confederate guerrilla leader William T. Anderson. Future outlaw Jesse James is among the guerrillas. Nevada is admitted to the Union. General Sherman and his forces marched through Georgia, destroying everything in their path to disrupt the Southern economy and transportation networks. General Sherman and his forces marched through Georgia, destroying everything in their path to disrupt the Southern economy and transportation networks. The Appomattox Courthouse is the final battle between the forces of General Ulysses Grant and General Robert E. Lee. Lee had spent the previous year defending Richmond but decided at this point to try to link up with other Confederate forces. He is forced to retreat to Appomattox Courthouse by Union forces and in the end has no choice but to surrender. John Wilkes Booth attends a speech by Abraham Lincoln promoting voting rights for African Americans. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain presides over the surrender of the Confederate infantry at Appomattox Courthouse. John Wilkes Booth mortally wounds Abraham Lincoln by shooting him in the back of the head. Robert Anderson returned to Fort Sumter to ceremoniously raise the Stars and Stripes over the stronghold that he had been forced to evacuate earlier, 4 years to the day. Abraham Lincoln dies from his wounds. John Wilkes Booth was found hiding in a barn but he refused to surrender. The barn was set ablaze, and Booth was shot inside the barn. Booth, fatally wounded in the neck, was dragged from the barn to the porch of Garrett's farmhouse, where he died 3 hours later. Confederate General Joseph Johnston surrenders to General William T. Sherman at the Bennett Place. General Richard Taylor surrendered the Confederate forces in the Department of Alabama, Mississippi and East Louisiana. Union soldiers captured Jefferson Davis. General Kirby Smith surrenders his Trans-Mississippi Command. Representatives of the 5 nations of Southern Indians, who were fighting for the Confederacy, surrender to Lieutenant Colonel Asa Matthews at Dokesville, in the Choctaw Nation. Brigadier General Stand Watie surrenders his battalion of Cherokee soldiers, making him the last Confederate general to lay down his sword. 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. Enacted by Congress over President Andrew Johnson's veto, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 aimed to counter black codes enacted by Southern states by validating the citizenship of former slaves and endowing them with specific, federally guaranteed, civil rights. President Andrew Johnson signed a proclamation, declaring that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exists in and throughout the whole of the United States of America. Nebraska is admitted to the Union. The United States signs a treaty with Russia for the purchase of Alaska, adding 586,412 square miles of new territory to the United States for the cost of $7.2 million, 2 cents per acre. President Andrew Johnson extends amnesty to a group of Confederate leaders, including P.G.T. Beauregard. 14th Amendment to the Constitution defines citizenship, contains the Privileges or Immunities Clause, the Due Process Clause, and the Equal Protection Clause, and deals with post-Civil War issues. Beginning with the execution of 27 black prisoners, whites conduct widespread attacks of African Americans in the vicinity of Opelousas, Louisiana, and are believed to have killed in total up to 200 to 250. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits the denial of the right to vote based on race, color or previous condition of servitude. Frederick Douglass' home in Rochester is burned to ruins. Arson was suspected but never proven. He relocates to the Washington, D.C. A United States Deputy Marshal arrests Susan B. Anthony for knowingly voting on the 5th of November, 1872, without having the lawful right to do so. A federal grand jury indicts Susan B. Anthony on the charge that she did knowingly, wrongfully and unlawfully vote for a representative in the Congress of the United States. The trial of United States v. Susan B. Anthony begins, presided by Supreme Court Justice Ward Hunt. Justice Ward Hunt rules that the defense of Susan B. Anthony had conceded the facts of the case, and he directed the jury to deliver a guilty verdict. He had written it beforehand, he said, to ensure that there would be no misapprehension about my views. East India Company ceases operation. Colorado is admitted to the Union. After President Ulysses S. Grant declines to seek a third term despite previously being expected to do so, the election is between Governor Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio and Governor Tilden of New York. The results of the election remain among the most disputed ever. Although it is not disputed that Tilden outpolls Hayes in the popular vote, after a first count of votes, Tilden wins 184 electoral votes to Hayes's 165, with 20 votes from 4 states unresolved. In Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, each party reported its candidate has won the state, while in Oregon, one elector is replaced after being declared illegal for being an elected or appointed official. The question of who should be awarded these electoral votes is the source of continued controversy. An informal deal is struck to resolve the dispute, the Compromise of 1877, which awards all 20 electoral votes to Hayes. In return for the Democrats' acquiescence to Hayes' election, the Republicans agree to withdraw federal troops from the South, ending Reconstruction. To date, it remains the election that recorded the smallest electoral vote victory, 185 to 184. The American Association of the Red Cross elected Clara Barton as its first president. James A. Garfield is shot by Charles J. Guiteau, who is immediately apprehended. James A. Garfield dies of his wounds. Charles J. Guiteau is found guilty in the assassination of President James A. Garfield. Charles J. Guiteau is hanged for the assassination of President James A. Garfield. North Dakota is admitted to the Union. South Dakota is admitted to the Union. Montana is admitted to the Union. Washington is admitted to the Union. Idaho is admitted to the Union. Wyoming is admitted to the Union. Queen Liliuokalani relinquishes power over Hawaii. Utah is admitted to the Union. The Supreme Court issues a 7-1 decision in a landmark decision. Plessy v. Ferguson upholds the constitutionality of racial segregation laws for public facilities as long as the segregated facilities are equal in quality, a doctrine that came to be known as separate but equal. The decision legitimizes the many state laws re-establishing racial segregation that had been passed in the American South after the end of the Reconstruction era, 1865-1877. The USS Maine is sunk in the Havana harbor. Congress passes the Teller Amendment, placing a condition on the United States military's presence in Cuba. According to the clause, the U.S. could not annex Cuba but only leave control of the island to its people. In short, the U.S. would help Cuba gain independence and then withdraw all its troops from the country. Congress approves a resolution declaring war with Spain by unanimous consent. The Treaty of Paris ends the Spanish-American War. Spain cedes Guam and Puerto Rico and its dependent islets to the United States, and transfers sovereignty over the Philippines to the United States. The Great Galveston Hurricane, the deadliest natural disaster in United States history and the fifth deadliest Atlantic hurricane overall, kills 8,000. Most of these deaths occurred in and near Galveston, Texas, after storm surge inundated the coastline with 8 to 12 feet of water. The hurricane leaves approximately 10,000 people in the city homeless, out of a total population of fewer than 38,000. Leon Cholgos intends to assassinate William McKinley at the fairgrounds of the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, but does not fire, uncertain of hitting his target. Leon Cholgos awaits William McKinley at the Temple of Music on the Exposition grounds, and shoots him twice in the abdomen. William McKinley dies from his wounds. Leon Cholgos is sentenced to death. Leon Cholgos is executed by electric chair. The Wright brothers make the first controlled, sustained flight in a heavier-than-air aircraft at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Hawaii is admitted to the Union. An earthquake in San Francisco leaves 500 dead or missing and destroys about 4 square mi of the city. Oklahoma is admitted to the Union. New Mexico is admitted to the Union. Arizona is admitted to the Union. Theodore Roosevelt is shot by John Flammane Schrank. Roosevelt then delivered a 84-minute speech before accepting medical attention. 16th Amendment to the Constitution permits Congress to levy an income tax without apportioning it among the various states or basing it on the United States Census. 17th Amendment to the Constitution establishes the direct election of United States Senators by popular vote. Capone kicked out of school at the age of 14 after beating up his teacher. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, are assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, one of a group of 6 assassins, 5 Serbs and 1 Bosniak, coordinated by Danilo Ilic, a Bosnian Serb and a member of the Black Hand Secret Society. Austria-Hungary seeks German support for a war against Serbia in case of Russian militarism. Germany gives assurances of support. Austria-Hungary sends an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia responds that night, agreeing to most but not all terms of the ultimatum. The Serbian response is seen as satisfactory by the Kaiser, but German diplomats do not pressure Austria to make peace. Serbia mobilizes, expecting Austria to declare war after the refusal of the ultimatum. Austria mobilizes. Russia enters the period preparatory to war, partial mobilization. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Germany sends Russia an ultimatum. Germany declares war on Russia and mobilizes. France mobilizes. Italy declares its neutrality. Denmark, Sweden and Norway unitedly declare their neutrality. Germany and the Ottoman Empire sign a secret alliance treaty. Germany declares war on France. Belgium denies permission for German forces to pass through to the French border. Switzerland declares its neutrality and mobilizes for purposes of defense. Britain protests against the violation of Belgian neutrality, guaranteed by the Treaty of London. The German Chancellor replies that the treaty is just a chiffon de paper, a scrap of paper. The United Kingdom declares war on Germany. Montenegro declares war on Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire closes the Dardanelles. Austria-Hungary declares war on Russia. Serbia declares war on Germany. Spain declares the strictest neutrality. Montenegro declares war on Germany. France declares war on Austria-Hungary. The United Kingdom declares war on Austria-Hungary. Japan declares war on Germany. Japan declares war on Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary declares war on Belgium. Russia declares war on the Ottoman Empire. Serbia declares war on the Ottoman Empire. Montenegro declares war on the Ottoman Empire. France and the United Kingdom, 38, declare war on the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mehmed V of the Ottoman Empire declares jihad on the Allies. The Battle of Bolimo is the first attempt by the Germans at a large-scale use of poison gas. The 18,000 gas shells they fire prove unsuccessful when the XYLYL bromide, a type of tear gas, is blown back at their own lines. The gas causes few, if any, casualties. The Triple Entente, United Kingdom, Russia and France, signed the secret Treaty of London with the Kingdom of Italy. Its intent is to have Italy break away from its 33-year-old Triple Alliance with the German Empire and Austria-Hungary, both the main central powers in the war, and to switch its allegiance to the Triple Entente, the main allies in the war. The main lure for Italy is a promise of large amounts of Austria-Hungary to the north of Italy and to the east across the Adriatic, and the promise of funding by Britain. Italy, which had remained neutral for the first 9 months of the war, promises to enter the war within a month. Italy revokes its commitment to a defensive alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. A German U-boat torpedoes British ocean liner Lusitania, bound for Liverpool from New York. 11 miles off the southern coast of Ireland inside the declared war zone. A second internal explosion sinks her in 18 minutes, killing 1,198 passengers and crew. Italy declares war on Austria-Hungary. Italy declares war on the Ottoman Empire. Germany suspends unrestricted submarine warfare. Despite international pressure for mercy, Edith Louisa Cavell is executed for treason, shot by German firing squad. A British nurse celebrated for saving the lives of soldiers from both sides without discrimination. She was arrested, found guilty by a court-martial, and sentenced to death for helping some 200 Allied soldiers escape from German-occupied Belgium. Her execution receives worldwide condemnation and extensive press coverage. Bulgaria declares war on Serbia. The United Kingdom and Montenegro declare war on Bulgaria. France declares war on Bulgaria. Italy and Russia declare war on Bulgaria. Pro-Central Powers Iranians seize Shiraz from pro-Entente forces and arrest all British citizens in the city. Conscription introduced in the United Kingdom by the Military Service Act 1916. Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany declares war on Portugal. Portugal officially enters the war. Austria-Hungary declares war on Portugal. Germany suspends unrestricted submarine warfare. The Battle of Jutland is the last major battle in world history fought primarily by battleships. The Italian troopship SS Principe Umberto is sunk by an Austro-Hungarian submarine. It is the deadliest sinking of the war, with 1,900 lives lost. German agents sabotage munition factories in Jersey City that supply the Allies, causing the Black Tom explosion. The Kingdom of Romania enters the war on the side of the Allied powers. Italy declares war on Germany. The Jones Law was passed by Congress, eventually leading to the Commonwealth of the Philippines and to independence from the United States. Paul von Hindenburg replaces Erich von Falkenhayn as German Chief of Staff. The Ottoman Empire declares war on Romania. Bulgaria declares war on Romania. The British use armoured tanks for the first time in history in the Battle of Flas Corselet. Jeannette Rankin of Montana is the first woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. The Germans occupy Bucharest. The capital of Romania moved to Iasi. Grigory Rasputin, Russia's eminent scribe, is assassinated. The German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann sends an encoded telegram to his ambassador in Mexico, instructing him to propose to the Mexican government an alliance against the United States. The telegram is intercepted by British intelligence. Publication of that communique outrages Americans. Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare. SS Housatonic, an American steamer carrying wheat from Galveston, Texas to England, is sunk by a U-boat. The celebrations of the International Women's Day in Petrograd spawn severe protests that will evolve into the February Revolution. Russian troops refuse to fire on demonstrators after 50 are killed in Petrograd's Znamenskaya Square the day before. Petrograd Soviet formed. China severs relations with Germany. Nicholas II abdicates. A provisional government is formed. Outraged public opinion of Germany's targeting of neutral ships in a designated war zone, and the sinking of 5 American merchant ships in March, now overwhelmingly supports Wilson when he asks Congress for a declaration of war. Congress approves a resolution declaring war with Germany. The United States declares war on Germany. Cuba and Panama declare war on Germany. Brazil severs relations with Germany. Bolivia severs relations with Germany. The Ottoman Empire severs relations with the United States. King Constantine I of Greece abdicates. First American troops land in France. Greece declares war on the Central Powers. After protests, the Russian government arrests Bolshevik leaders, including Leon Trotsky. Vladimir Lenin flees to Finland. Siam declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Senate passes a resolution to present a constitutional amendment prohibiting the sale or consumption of alcohol to the states for ratification. Liberia declares war on Germany. China declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. Russia declared a republic. Costa Rica severs relations with Germany. Peru severs relations with Germany. Uruguay severs relations with Germany. Brazil declares war on Germany. The British government supports plans for a Jewish national home in Palestine in the Balfour Declaration. The October Revolution, Red October, is led by the Bolshevik Party of Vladimir Lenin. An armed insurrection which seizes the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government located in Petrograd, then capital of Russia. Alexander Kerensky, the leader of the provisional government, flees. An accidental collision between the Norwegian supply ship SS IMO and the French cargo ship SS Mont Blanc, laden with high explosives for the Western Front, leaves 2,000 dead and 9,000 injured in Richmond, Nova Scotia. It is the largest man-made explosion before the invention of atomic weapons. Finland declares independence from Russia. The United States declares war on Austria-Hungary. Ecuador severs relations with Germany. Romania signs an armistice with the Central Powers. Panama declares war on Austria-Hungary. General Allenby leads British and Indian troops into Jerusalem, ending 400 years of Ottoman rule. Al Capone is attacked by a man for insulting his sister. A knife wound to the face leaves him with the nickname Scarface. Armistice of Erzincan between the Ottomans and the Russian Special Transcaucasian Committee. Armistice between Russia and the Central Powers. The Central Powers sign an exclusive protectorate treaty with the Ukrainian People's Republic as part of the negotiations in Brest-Litovsk. Germans capture Minsk. Germans capture Zhytomyr. Germans capture Tallinn. Germans capture Pskov and Narva. Germans capture Kiev. Leon Trotsky signs the peace treaty with Germany. First known case of what will later be called Spanish flu appears at Fort Riley, Kansas. Over 100 sick from Spanish flu in Fort Riley, first known case outside in Queens, New York. Ottokar Chernin resigns as Austria-Hungary's foreign minister over the failed attempt by Emperor Charles I of Austria to conclude a separate peace with the Allies. The Red Baron is shot down over Vaux-sur-Somme. He is considered the ace of aces of the war, being officially credited with 80 air combat victories. Guatemala declares war on Germany. Gavrilo Princip, the assassin Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and the Archduke's wife, dies in Terezin prison, from tuberculosis. Treaty of Bucharest between Romania and the Central Powers. It will never be ratified. Nicaragua declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. Costa Rica declares war on Germany. Third Battle of the Aisne is one of the first instances wherein appreciable numbers of American troops participate and had proved themselves in combat. British and French troops land at Murmansk in northern Russia. It's the beginning of Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War on the White Army's side. Haiti declares war on Germany. Nicholas II and his family are executed by the Bolsheviks, out of fear that they might be released by Czechoslovak and white troops. Honduras declares war on Germany. The United Kingdom ratifies the Treaty of Versailles. Spanish flu virus mutates into a far deadlier strain. A second wave of the pandemic begins. Bulgaria signs an armistice with the Allies. Tsar Ferdinand I of Bulgaria abdicates and Boris III accedes to the throne. Germany requests an armistice to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who demands German withdrawal from all occupied territory, and the Kaiser's abdication. Germany suspends submarine warfare. The German Imperial Naval Command in Kiel under Admiral Franz von Hipper plans to dispatch the fleet for a final battle against the Royal Navy in the English Channel. The naval order and the preparations to sail trigger a mutiny among the affected sailors. The Ottoman Empire signs the Armistice of Mudros. Austria-Hungary armistice with Italy. German Emperor Kaiser William II abdicates, Republic proclaimed. Emperor of Austria Kaiser Charles I abdicates. Romania renews the war against the Central Powers. At 6 a.m., Germany signs the Armistice of Compiègne. End of fighting at 11 a.m. The Republic of Poland proclaimed. Austria proclaimed a republic. Czechoslovakia proclaimed a republic. German U-boats interned. Alexander Kolchak seizes control of the Provisional All-Russian government in a coup. Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes proclaimed. 18th Amendment to the Constitution prohibited the manufacturing or sale of alcohol within the United States. The U.S. Supreme Court issues a decision in Schenck v. United States concerning enforcement of the Espionage Act of 1917 during World War I. A unanimous Supreme Court concludes that defendants who distributed flyers to draft-age men urging resistance to induction could be convicted of an attempt to obstruct the draft, a criminal offense. The First Amendment does not alter the well-established law in cases where the attempt is made through expressions that are protected in other circumstances. Expressions which in the circumstances are intended to result in a crime, and posed a clear and present danger of succeeding, can be punished. The Treaty of Versailles, a peace treaty that determines that Germans should accept blame for causing the war, limit their army to 100,000, cede land and pay reparations. Germany ratifies the Treaty of Versailles. The National Prohibition Act, known informally as the Volstead Act, was enacted to carry out the intent of the 18th Amendment, which established prohibition in the United States. First meeting of the League of Nations held in London. Official end of World War I. Treaty of Trianon between the Allies and Hungary. Treaty of Sevres between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire. The treaty is not recognized by the Turkish national movement, which considers the Istanbul government illegitimate. 19th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits the denial of the right to vote based on sex. League of Nations headquarters moved to Geneva, Switzerland. The League of Nations holds its first General Assembly. Mobs of white residents, many of them deputized and given weapons by city officials, attacked black residents and businesses of the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It has been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. The attack, carried out on the ground and from private aircraft, destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the district, at that time the wealthiest black community in the United States, known as Black Wall Street. More than 800 people were admitted to hospitals, and as many as 6,000 black residents were interned in large facilities, many of them for several days. The Oklahoma Bureau of Vital Statistics officially recorded 36 dead. Munich Beer Hall Putsch. Adolf Hitler directs his party's troops, known as brown shirts, to surround the Munich Beer Hall where the leaders of the Bavarian government are meeting. He steps inside, stands on a table and fires a shot into the air. The leaders of the Bavarian government are taken into a side room while Hitler speaks to those remaining in the hall, telling them that the German Revolution is underway. Around 3,000 Nazis led by Hitler, Hermann Göring and General Ludendorff march towards Munich. When they reached the city, they find a police barricade waiting for them. Shots are fired and the marchers disperse. Adolf Hitler is arrested for his part in the Munich Beer Hall Putsch and charged with treason. Al Capone's brother Frank is killed by police. Adolf Hitler is found guilty of treason and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison. While in prison he is determined to try to gain power legitimately by standing for election. He writes the book Mein Kampf, which set out his ideals. Adolf Hitler is released from prison. After making a passionate and inflammatory speech against the establishment, Adolf Hitler is banned from public speaking in Bavaria. Jaime E. Weiss and Bucks Moran assassination attempt of Al Capone. Gangster Jaime E. Weiss killed by Capone's mob. Charles Lindbergh makes the first solo non-stop transatlantic flight in his plane The Spirit of St. Louis. Street Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone is arrested by FBI agents as he leaves a Chicago courtroom after testifying to a grand jury that was investigating violations of federal prohibition laws. He is charged with contempt of court for feigning illness to avoid an earlier appearance. Al Capone is arrested in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for carrying a concealed weapon. Al Capone is indicted by a federal grand jury on 22 counts of income tax evasion from 1925 through 1929. He was released on $50,000 bail. A week later, Elliot Ness and his team of untouchables inflicted major financial damage on Capone's operations, and led to his indictment on 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act, prohibition laws. In the courtroom of Judge James Herbert Wilkerson, Al Capone pleaded guilty to income tax evasion and the 5,000 Volstead Act violations as part of a 2.5-year prison sentence plea bargain. Judge Wilkerson refuses to honor Al Capone's plea bargain, and Capone's counsel rescinded the guilty pleas. On the second day of the trial, Judge Wilkerson overruled objections that a lawyer could not confess for his client, saying that anyone making a statement to the government did so at his own risk. Wilkerson deemed that the 1930 letter to federal authorities could be admitted into evidence from a lawyer acting for Capone. Wilkerson later tried Capone only on the income tax evasion charges as he determined they took precedence over the Volstead Act charges. Al Capone is convicted on 5 counts of income tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Hattie Wyatt Caraway of Arkansas is the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate, to fill a vacancy caused by the death of her husband. The Star-Spangled Banner is adopted as the national anthem. Amelia Earhart completes first solo non-stop transatlantic flight by a woman. German Chancellor resigns. President Paul von Hindenburg appoints Franz von Papen as the new Chancellor. Hermann Göring tables a vote of no confidence against Chancellor Franz von Papen. However, rather than face the vote, von Papen calls a new election. Chancellor von Papen resigns. Adolf Hitler immediately asks Paul Hindenburg to appoint him as the new Chancellor, but Hindenburg refuses. Kurt von Schleicher is appointed Chancellor of Germany. 20th Amendment to the Constitution changes the date on which the terms of the President and Vice President and of members of Congress end and begin, to the 20th of January and January the 3rd respectively. States that if the President-elect becomes vacant, the Vice President-elect is inaugurated as President in their place. Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher asks Hindenburg to dissolve Parliament and call a new election. Hindenburg refuses and Schleicher resigns. Paul Hindenburg appoints Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. Hitler immediately presses Hindenburg to allow new elections to be held in March. The Cullen Harrison Act legalizes the sale in the United States of beer and wine. The Enabling Act is passed, giving Hitler and the cabinet the power to make laws and approve treaties independently of Parliament. In effect, it gives Hitler dictatorial powers. The 21st Amendment to the Constitution repeals the 18th Amendment and makes it a federal offense to transport or import intoxicating liquors into U.S. states and territories where such is prohibited by law. The Philippine Independence Act establishes the process for the Philippines to become an independent country after a 10-year transition. The President of Germany, Paul Hindenburg, dies. Hitler declares that the office of President is no longer necessary and that he will combine the post of President and Chancellor to become Führer of Germany. Edward VIII abdicates as King of the United Kingdom to marry Wallis Simpson, an American who had divorced one husband and was seeking a divorce. The Munich Agreement, an agreement by Nazi Germany, the United Kingdom, the French Third Republic and the Kingdom of Italy is signed. It provides cession to Germany of the Sudeten German territory of Czechoslovakia. Most of Europe celebrates the agreement, because it prevents the war threatened by Adolf Hitler by allowing Nazi Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland, a region of western Czechoslovakia inhabited by more than 3 million people, mainly German speakers. Germany invades and occupies Czechoslovakia in direct contravention of the Munich Agreement. Hitler is convinced that Britain and France will not go to war over his action. In response to Nazi Germany's defiance of the Munich Agreement and its occupation of Czechoslovakia, the United Kingdom pledges the support of itself and France to assure Polish independence. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, is signed enabling them to partition Poland between them. Germany invades Poland. France and Britain declare war on Germany for failing to cease military operations in Poland. The declaration is followed by Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and Canada. Poland surrenders to Germany. Germany invades and occupies Denmark. Germany invades Norway. Germany invades and occupies Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg. Germany invades France. British and French forces are pushed back to Dunkirk and have to be rescued from the beaches. Norway surrenders to Germany. France surrenders to Germany. Germany, Italy and Japan sign the Tripartite Pact, a defensive military alliance. Hungary signs the Tripartite Pact. Romania signs the Tripartite Pact. Slovakia signs the Tripartite Pact. Bulgaria signs the Tripartite Pact. Yugoslavia signs the Tripartite Pact. After signing the Tripartite Pact 2 days prior, the Yugoslavian regime is overthrown in a military coup d'état with British support. 17-year-old King Peter II is declared to be of age. The new Yugoslav government refuses to ratify Yugoslavia's signing of the Tripartite Pact and start negotiations with the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler issues Directive 25 as an answer to the Yugoslavian coup and attacks both Yugoslavia and Greece on the 6th of April. Yugoslavia surrenders. Congress approves a resolution declaring war with Japan. The Senate unanimously approves the resolution, 82-0. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor by his Japanese allies, Adolf Hitler declares war on the United States. Congress approves resolutions declaring war with Germany and Italy. The Senate unanimously approves each resolution. A meeting of senior government officials of Nazi Germany and SS leaders is held in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. The Wannsee Conference is to ensure the cooperation of administrative leaders of various government departments in the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question, whereby most of the Jews of German-occupied Europe would be deported to occupied Poland and murdered. Congress approves resolutions declaring war with Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. The Senate unanimously approves each resolution. The Grand Council of Fascism passes a motion of no confidence in Benito Mussolini. Later that day the king dismisses him as head of government and has him placed in custody, appointing Pietro Badoglio to succeed him as prime minister. Italy signs the Armistice of Cassabile, an armistice between the Kingdom of Italy and the Allies during World War II. It is signed in Sicily, which had recently been occupied by the Allies. The armistice is approved by both King Victor Emmanuel III and Italian Prime Minister Pietro Badoglio. The armistice stipulates the surrender of Italy to the Allies. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini is rescued from the Gran Sasso d'Italia Massif by German paratroopers and SS commandos in the Gran Sasso raid. The airborne operation is personally ordered by Adolf Hitler. D-Day, Allied forces invade Normandy is northern France, in Operation Overlord. Adolf Hitler survives Operation Valkyrie, an assassination plot to bomb him while addressing a number of generals. While attempting to refuel its ships in worsening weather, Admiral Halsey unwittingly sails the Third Fleet into the center of Typhoon Cobra. 790 lives are lost, 9 warships are damaged, and over 100 aircraft are either wrecked or washed overboard. Benito Mussolini is executed by the Italian resistance movement. With Soviet troops within a block or two of the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the head and brawn bites into a cyanide capsule. Their bodies are carried outside to the garden behind the Reich Chancellery, where they are placed in a bomb crater, doused with petrol, and set on fire as the Red Army shelling continues. Germany unconditionally surrenders to the Allies in Reims, France, ending World War II and the Third Reich. The first detonation of a nuclear device as part of the Manhattan Project. The test is conducted on what was then the USAF Alamogordo bombing and gunnery range, now part of White Sands Missile Range. U.S. President Harry S. Truman, United Kingdom Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and President of China Chiang Kai-shek issue the Potsdam Declaration, calling for the surrender of all Japanese armed forces during World War II. The document outlines the terms of surrender for the Empire of Japan, as agreed upon at the Potsdam Conference. The ultimatum states that, if Japan does not surrender, it will face prompt and utter destruction. At 8:15 a.m., Hiroshima time, the nuclear weapon Little Boy is dropped on Hiroshima from an American Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the Enola Gay, directly killing at least 70,000 people, including thousands of Korean slave laborers. Fewer than 10% of the casualties are military. By the end of the year, injury and radiation brings the total number of deaths to 90,000,166,000. The USSR declares war on Japan. During the February 1945 Yalta Conference, Stalin agreed to enter the fight against the Empire of Japan in 2 or 3 months after Germany has surrendered and the war in Europe is terminated. Germany officially surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, and the USSR declares war 3 months later. At 11:02 a.m., Nagasaki time, the nuclear weapon Fat Man is dropped on Nagasaki from an American B-29 Superfortress, Boxcar. 53 seconds after its release, the bomb explodes at 11:02 a.m. at an approximate altitude of 1,800 feet. Less than a second after the detonation, the north of the city was destroyed and 35,000 people were killed. The Japanese Foreign Ministry sends telegrams to the Allies announcing that Japan will accept the Potsdam Declaration, but will not accept any peace conditions that will prejudice the prerogatives of the Emperor. That effectively meant no change in Japan's form of government, that the Emperor of Japan would remain a position of real power. The Soviet Union begins occupying the north of Korea. The Allies respond to Japan's qualified acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. From the moment of surrender, the authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, who will take such steps as he deems proper to effectuate the surrender terms. The ultimate form of government of Japan shall, in accordance with the Potsdam Declaration, be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. U.S. Army officers Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel consult a National Geographic map of Asia to determine the post-war dividing line between Soviet and U.S. zones of control in Korea. Neither man is an expert on the country, and, failing to find any obvious natural barrier between the North and the South, select the 38th parallel, a border that was tentatively proposed at the Potsdam Conference. This division places the capital city of Seoul in the American zone but just 35 miles south of the dividing line. In a recorded speech, the Emperor of Japan addresses the nation on Japan's unconditional surrender. Soviet forces halt at the 38th parallel to await the arrival of U.S. forces from the south. Representatives from the Empire of Japan formally signed the Japanese instrument of surrender in Tokyo Bay aboard USS Missouri. The Treaty of Manila of 1946 relinquishes U.S. sovereignty over the Philippines and recognizes the independence of the Republic of the Philippines. Al Capone suffers a stroke, regains consciousness but contracts bronchopneumonia. The Republic of Korea, South Korea, is established. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, is established. Having destroyed the bulk of the North Korean army, UN troops have pressed on into North Korea and are now approaching the Yalu River. Chinese People's Volunteers Force troops cross into North Korea and inflict serious losses on the lead units of the UN advance. The sudden appearance of Chinese forces sends the main body of UN forces reeling back to the south bank of the Chngchn River. 22nd Amendment to the Constitution limits the number of times a person can be elected president. 22nd Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, limiting the president to 2 terms. U.S. President Harry S. Truman relieves MacArthur of command for insubordination and his unwillingness to prosecute a limited war. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are executed for passing secret information about U.S. atomic weaponry to the Soviets. Mark W. Clark for the UN command, Peng Dehuai for the Chinese, and Kim Il-sung for North Korea conclude an armistice ending hostilities. A demilitarized zone is created that roughly follows the pre-war border along the 38th parallel. South Korean President Syngman re-announces his acceptance of the agreement, but no representative of South Korea ever signs the document. Viet Minh troops overrun the French base at Dien Bien Phu. The stunning victory by Vietnamese forces brings an end to nearly a century of French colonial rule in Indochina. The Supreme Court issues a unanimous, 9-0, decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, in which the court rules that U.S. state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools are unconstitutional, even if the segregated schools are otherwise equal in quality, stating that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, and therefore violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The Saigon Military Mission, a covert operation to conduct psychological warfare and paramilitary activities in South Vietnam, is launched. This marks the beginning of the Vietnam War. Many of the mission's ongoing efforts are directed at supporting the regime of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem. The Geneva Accords effectively divide Vietnam in two at the 17th parallel. Although the Accords explicitly state that the 17th parallel should not in any way be interpreted as constituting a political or territorial boundary, it is quickly afforded exactly that status. Arkansas Governor Orville Phobos orders the Arkansas National Guard to surround Central High School to keep the 9 students from entering the school as part of integrating the school following the Brown v.S. Board of Education of Topeka Supreme Court ruling. President Eisenhower ordered the 101st Airborne Division into Little Rock to ensure the safety of the Little Rock Nine and that the rulings of the Supreme Court are upheld. He also federalizes the Arkansas National Guard and ordered them to support the integration, after which they are to protect the African American students. Alaska is admitted to the Union. The 23rd Amendment to the Constitution grants the District of Columbia electors in the Electoral College. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first person in space. Alan Shepard is the first American to travel into space. Friendship 7, piloted by astronaut John Glenn, is America's first space flight to orbit the Earth. The CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center reviews U-2 surveillance photographs of Cuba and identifies objects that they interpreted as medium-range ballistic missiles. The U.S. Supreme Court issues a unanimous decision in Gideon v. Wainwright that in criminal cases states are required under the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution to provide an attorney to defendants who are unable to afford their own attorneys. The case extended the right to counsel, which had been found under the Fifth and Sixth Amendments to impose requirements on the federal government, by imposing those requirements upon the states as well. South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem is assassinated by his own generals as part of a coup d'état that is carried out with the tacit support of U.S. officials. Ngo's autocratic and violent excesses when dealing with South Vietnam's majority Buddhist population led the U.S. to withdraw its patronage of him. At this point, approximately 16,000 U.S. military personnel are in Vietnam, and 200 have been killed. 24th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits the revocation of voting rights due to the non-payment of a poll tax or any other tax. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlaws discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, requiring equal access to public places and employment, and enforces desegregation of schools and the right to vote. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, a real confrontation and a fabricated confrontation between ships of North Vietnam and the United States in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The original American report blames North Vietnam for both incidents, but the Pentagon Papers, the memoirs of Robert McNamara, and NSA publications from 2005, prove that the U.S. government lied to justify a war against Vietnam. U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson submits the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to Congress. The resolution authorizes the President to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States. Congress overwhelmingly passes the resolution. Approximately 23,000 U.S. troops are in Vietnam, and roughly 400 have been killed. State troopers attack peaceful demonstrators led by Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., as they try to cross bridge in Selma, Ala. Alexei Leonov becomes the first person to leave a spacecraft in a specialized spacesuit and conducts a 12-minute spacewalk. Gemini 4 marks the first spacewalk by an American, during which White floats free outside the spacecraft, tethered to it, for approximately 20 minutes. The U.S. Supreme Court issues a decision in Miranda v. Arizona that the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution prevents prosecutors from using a person's statements made in response to interrogation in police custody as evidence at their trial unless they can show that the person was informed of the right to consult with an attorney before and during questioning. and of the right against self-incrimination before police questioning, and that the defendant not only understood these rights, but voluntarily waived them. Apollo 1 catches fire during a launch rehearsal test, killing all 3 crew members: Command Pilot Virgil Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Ed White, and Pilot Roger B. Chaffee, and destroyed the command module. The name Apollo 1, chosen by the crew, was made official by NASA in their honor after the fire. 25th Amendment to the Constitution addresses succession to the presidency and establishes procedures both for filling a vacancy in the office of the vice president and responding to presidential disabilities. U.S. soldiers kill between 347 and 504 unarmed people, including men, women, children, and infants in the Emley Massacre. Apollo 8 is the first human spaceflight to reach another astronomical object, namely the Moon, which the crew orbits without landing. The U.S. Supreme Court issues a decision in Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District that defines First Amendment rights of students in U.S. public schools. The Tinker test, also known as the substantial disruption test, is still used by courts today to determine whether a school's interest to prevent disruption infringes upon students' First Amendment rights. Astronaut Neil Armstrong is the first man to walk on the Moon. Millions of people across the United States take to the streets to protest the continued U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The anti-war demonstrations represent the largest public protests in U.S. history to date. A U.S. mission to rescue hostages in Iran is aborted after a helicopter and cargo plane collide at the staging site in a remote part of Iran and 8 servicemen are killed. 4 students are shot to death by National Guardsmen during an anti-war protest at Kent State University. Members of the Ohio National Guard open fire on unarmed college students at Kent State University, killing 4 and wounding 9. The incident catalyzes the growing anti-war movement. Roughly 335,000 U.S. troops are in Vietnam, and approximately 50,000 have been killed. The New York Times begins publishing the Pentagon Papers, the Defense Department's secret history of the Vietnam War. The Washington Post will begin publishing the papers later in the week. 26th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits the denial of the right of U.S. citizens 18 years of age or older to vote on account of age. The 26th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. The Plumbers, a team of ex-FBI and CIA operatives, break into the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, in an unsuccessful attempt to steal psychiatric records to smear Daniel Ellsberg, the defense analyst who leaked the Pentagon Papers to the press. The Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. is broken into for the first time, bugging the telephones of staffers. 5 people are arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Washington, D.C. Watergate office building. Bob Woodward has his first of several meetings with the source and informant known as Deep Throat, later revealed to be Associate Director of the FBI W. Mark Felt. Martha Mitchell is held against her will by her security detail, at the order of her husband Attorney General John Mitchell, because she knew one of the Watergate burglars and was likely to speak to the media linking him to the Nixon administration. Mitchell reported that, during the week following the Watergate burglary, she had been held captive in the Watergate Complex Hotel, and that a security guard ended her call, a United Press reporter, by pulling the phone cord from the wall. Mitchell makes several attempts to escape via the balcony, but is physically accosted, injured, and forcefully sedated by a psychiatrist. An article in the Washington Post reports that a check for $25,000 earmarked for Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign was deposited into the bank account of one of the men arrested for the Watergate break-in. Nixon announces that John Dean has completed an internal investigation into the Watergate break-in, and has found no evidence of White House involvement. The Washington Post reports that while serving as Attorney General, John Mitchell had controlled a secret fund to finance intelligence gathering against Democrats. When Carl Bernstein calls Mitchell for comment, Mitchell threatens both Bernstein and Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Post. The Post prints the threat. Woodward and Bernstein report that the FBI had made connections between Nixon aides and the Watergate break-in. Nixon is elected to a second term in office after defeating Democratic candidate George McGovern. The Watergate break-in trial begins. The Supreme Court issues a 7-2 decision ruling in Roe v. Wade that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. Representatives of South Vietnamese Communist Forces, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the United States conclude the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam in Paris. U.S. troops are to be withdrawn within 60 days, and the 17th parallel will remain the dividing line until the country can be reunited by peaceful means. The agreement is not ratified by the United States Senate. Former Nixon aide and FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy and James McCord, an ex-CIA agent and former security director of the Committee to Re-elect the President, are convicted for their roles in the break-in at the Watergate complex. They are found guilty of conspiracy, bugging DNC headquarters, and burglary. 4 others, including E. Howard Hunt, had already pleaded guilty. Judge John J. Sirica threatens the convicted burglars with long prison sentences unless they talk. Ceasefire takes effect, officially ending the Laotian Civil War. In a White House meeting, White House counsel John Dean tells Nixon, "We have a cancer, within, close to the presidency, that's growing." He and Nixon discuss how to pay the Watergate bribers as much as $1 million in cash to continue the cover-up. Watergate burglar James McCord's letter confessing the existence of a wider conspiracy is read in open court by Judge Sirica. The Watergate cover-up starts to unravel. The last U.S. military unit leaves Vietnam. In over a decade of fighting, some 58,000 U.S. troops have been killed. Vietnamese casualties include more than 200,000 South Vietnamese troops and more than 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong irregulars. Civilian deaths total as many as 2 million. White House counsel John Dean begins cooperating with Watergate prosecutors. The Watergate scandal intensifies as Nixon announces that White House aides John A. Lichtman and H.R. Haldeman have resigned. White House counsel John Dean is fired. Attorney General Richard Kleindienst resigns. Later that night, Nixon delivers his first primetime address to the nation on Watergate, stressing his innocence. Alexander Butterfield, former Presidential Appointments Secretary, meets with Senate investigators, where he reveals the existence of an extensive, secret taping system in the White House. Alexander Butterfield testifies before the Senate committee in a live broadcast, revealing that since 1971 Nixon had recorded all conversations and telephone calls in his offices. Nixon reportedly orders the White House taping system disconnected. Vice President Spiro Agnew resigns, amidst bribery and income tax evasion charges, unrelated to the Watergate break-in. Nixon orders the firing of Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox in what becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Attorney General Elliot Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaws resign rather than carry out these orders. Solicitor General Robert Bork fires Cox. Leon Yaworsky is appointed as the new special prosecutor. White House Watergate counsel J. Fred Bajart reveals the existence of an 18.5-minute gap on the tape of Nixon-Haldeman conversation on the 20th of June, 1972. The White House is unable to explain the gap, although Nixon's secretary Rosemary Woods will later claim she accidentally erased the material. Indictments are handed down for the Watergate 7 including John Mitchell, H.R. Haldeman and John A. Lichtman. The grand jury names Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator. Transcripts of more than 1,200 pages of edited transcripts of the Nixon tapes are released by the White House. House Judiciary Committee starts impeachment proceedings against Nixon. The Supreme Court rules that Nixon must surrender dozens of original tape recordings of conversations to Special Prosecutor Yaworsky. Nixon releases transcripts of 3 conversations with Haldeman on the 23rd of June, 1972. Known as the smoking gun, the transcripts reveal Nixon's involvement in the Watergate cover-up. Facing a nearly certain impeachment and removal from office, President Richard Nixon resigns the presidency of the United States. President Gerald Ford issues Proclamation 4311, giving Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he might have committed against the United States while president. Shortly before 11 a.m., the American radio service network begins to broadcast the pre-recorded message that the temperature in Sigon is 105 degrees and rising, followed by a 30-second excerpt from the song White Christmas. This signals the start of Operation Frequent Wind. The emergency evacuation of Sigon. American personnel begin converging on more than a dozen assembly points throughout the city. Over the next 24 hours, some 7,000 Americans and South Vietnamese are flown to safety. The following morning, North Vietnamese troops enter downtown Saigon and the South Vietnamese government surrenders unconditionally. During a public gathering at New York City Hall, General of the Armies of the United States. The first of the new Space Shuttle approach and landing tests are performed. The U.S. Supreme Court issues a decision in Regents of the University of California v. Back that upholds affirmative action, allowing race to be one of several factors in college admission policy. However, the court rules that specific racial quotas, such as the 16 out of 100 seats set aside for minority students by the University of California, Davis School of Medicine, are impermissible. Space Shuttle Challenger experiences a structural failure during its ascent phase 73 seconds after launch from Kennedy Space Center, killing all 7 crew members and destroying the orbiter. Iraq invades and annexes Kuwait. The UN Security Council passes Resolution 660, condemning the invasion and demanding the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi forces. The UN Security Council issues Resolution 678, calling for the use of all necessary means to force Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait if it has not done so by the 15th of January, 1991. With the military build-up in Saudi Arabia well underway and the 15th of January deadline for Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait approaching, the U.S. Congress passes a resolution authorizing the use of military force. UN Security Council deadline passes for Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. A Scud missile fired from Iraq destroys a barracks used by U.S. troops in Khobar, Saudi Arabia. 28 Americans are killed and about 100 are wounded. U.S. and Allied forces enter Kuwait City. U.S. President George Bush declares the suspension of offensive combat operations against Iraq. Iraq announces that it will accept all UN resolutions regarding the conflict. Iraq accepts the terms of a ceasefire agreement presented by General Schwarzkopf. The 27th Amendment to the Constitution delays laws affecting congressional salary from taking effect until after the next election of representatives. A truck bomb explodes below the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City, killing 6 people and injuring over 1,000. An act of domestic terrorism in Oklahoma City when a bomb hidden inside a rental truck explodes outside a federal building, killing 168 people and injuring 680 others. The US and Britain launch airstrikes against weapons sites in Iraq. The House of Representatives votes to impeach President Clinton on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. The US Senate acquits Clinton of impeachment charges. No clear Timothy McVeigh is executed by lethal injection for his involvement in the Oklahoma City bombing 6 years prior. 2 hijacked jetliners ram Twin Towers of World Trade Center in worst terrorist attack against U.S., a 3rd hijacked plane flies into the Pentagon, and a 4th crashes in rural Pennsylvania. 2,977 victims are killed by the Al-Qaeda terrorists. US-led forces begin military action in Afghanistan. U.S. President George W. Bush identifies Iraq, along with Iran and North Korea, as part and axis of evil in his State of the Union address. President Bush addresses the United Nations General Assembly and warns Iraq that military action will be unavoidable if it does not comply with UN resolutions on disarmament. The UK publishes a dossier on the threat posed by Iraq. It includes the claim that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction which could be used within 45 minutes. The UN Security Council unanimously passes Resolution 1441, giving Iraq a final opportunity to comply with its disarmament obligations and warning of serious consequences if it does not. Space Shuttle Columbia breaks up upon re-entry into the atmosphere, killing all 7 crew members. The US and the UK submit a draft resolution to the UN, stating that Iraq has missed its final opportunity to disarm peacefully. But this is opposed by France, Russia and Germany. France and Russia announce that they are ready to veto a UN Security Council resolution which gives Iraq 7 days to disarm. U.S. President George W. Bush delivers a televised address to the world, in which he summarizes the past few months' events between the United States and Iraq. He demands that Saddam Hussein vacate his office and leave Iraq within 2 days, or else the U.S. and its allies will invade Iraq and depose his regime. In the United Kingdom, Leader of the House of Commons Robin Cook resigns in protest of Prime Minister Tony Blair's support of the American invasion. The UK, the US and Spain abandon their attempt to secure a second UN resolution authorizing force. US President George Bush gives Saddam and his sons 48 hours to leave Iraq or face war. Tony Blair wins House of Commons backing to send UK forces into war in Iraq, despite a major rebellion by Labour MPs. The government of Saddam Hussein loses control over Iraq's capital Baghdad, with the advance of US forces into the center of the city. President Bush appears on an aircraft carrier off the coast of California to declare victory. A BBC report casts doubt on the government's 2002 dossier stating that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction capable of being deployed within 45 minutes. Saddam Hussein is captured by US troops in a cellar south of Tikrit, his hometown. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him, says US Administrator Paul Bremer. Saddam Hussein is hanged, after being found guilty of the killings of 148 Shias from the town of Dujail in the 1980s. Germany makes final reparations payments from the Treaty of Versailles from World War I. Osama bin Laden, founder of the pan-Islamic militant organization Al-Qaeda and mastermind of the 11th of September, 2001 attacks, is killed in Abbottabad, Pakistan by a United States military special operations unit. Bin Laden is on the American Federal Bureau of Investigation's lists of 10 most wanted fugitives and most wanted terrorists for his involvement in the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings. Coronavirus disease 2019, or COVID-19, is a contagious disease caused by severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2. The first case is identified in Wuhan, China. Symptoms of COVID-19 are variable, but often include fever, cough, fatigue, breathing difficulties, and loss of smell and taste. Symptoms begin 1 to 14 days after exposure to the virus. Around 1 in 5 infected individuals do not develop any symptoms. While most people have mild symptoms, some people develop acute respiratory distress syndrome. ARDS can be precipitated by cytokine storms, multi-organ failure, septic shock, and blood clots. Longer-term damage to organs, in particular, the lungs and heart, has been observed. There is concern about a significant number of patients who have recovered from the acute phase of the disease but continue to experience a range of effects, known as long COVID, for months afterwards. These effects include severe fatigue, memory loss and other cognitive issues, low-grade fever, muscle weakness, and breathlessness. The death rate is reported to be over 3% for those infected. The impeachment of Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, is initiated when the House of Representatives approved articles of impeachment on charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Trump's impeachment comes after a formal House inquiry alleges that he had solicited foreign interference in the 2020 U.S. presidential election to help his re-election bid, and then obstructed the inquiry itself by telling his administration officials to ignore subpoenas for documents and testimony. President Trump is acquitted on both counts by the Senate. Republican Mitt Romney, the only senator to break party lines, becomes the first U.S. senator to vote to convict a president of his own party in an impeachment trial, as he votes for conviction on abuse of power. The World Health Organization declares the COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic. The United States surpasses 100,000 deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic. The United States surpasses 200,000 deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic. The United States surpasses 300,000 deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic.